my talk today is, I think, pretty unusual. It's going to be somewhat informal, a bit speculative, a bit introspective, and but the good news is that most of the work from my lab that I'm going to cover today is not public yet, and some of it are even some experiments that finished at like 6 a.m. So you're going to hopefully see something new. The other disclaimer is that I woke up at 4 a.m. So if I'm a little incoherent, please stop me and ask questions. And also feel free to stop me and share your own thoughts and disagreements and whatnot. So just to set the stage, I don't even really necessarily feel like I need to say this, but I do want to kind of start by talking about how things look different today than they did when I started doing deep learning research in, let's say, like 2012 or so. And I struggled finding a good way to visualize this, but this plot from the AI Index 2026 report is one way of encapsulating this. This is just showing global investment in AI. And you can see that, back in 2012, there wasn't a lot of investment in AI, which probably correlates with the number of products that were using AI, which probably correlates with the extent to which AI is like ingrained in everyone's technological workflows.
Also, AI meant something different in 2012.
Yeah, that's true. This report, I think, includes AI broadly, so it would have been anything about machine learning, deep learning, et cetera. So yeah, but things are different now. I started in 2012. We had kind of this early era where applications of deep learning started to be deployed in products like neural machine translation, speech and image recognition, and now we're kind of in this era where where language model based AI systems are widely proliferating, and I think apart from the financial side of things, I think there was a meaningful change sometime late last year when many of us, especially those of us who do technical work, really felt like these systems got notably more useful. This is what Simon Willison calls the November inflection point. And I think he's right. I think a lot of us probably over the last 6 months have been kind of reckoning with the fact that a lot of the skills that we developed as experimenters are now not fully automatable, but certainly highly accelerated, and what the implications of that are. But since I'm the one talking and you have to listen to me, I'm going to share a different story about how I felt the major shift in, let's say AI capabilities 6 months ago. And the specific example I'm going to talk about is that when I was in 5th grade, I had this wonderful teacher, and on the last day of school, she showed us a movie that completely traumatized me. It was terrifying. And for the last decade or longer, I've been trying to track her down to ask her what the movie was and why she showed it to us. So here's an example. At one point, I decided to try to figure out what her email was, and this was in 2024, so not that long ago. And I just started emailing every email I could find that I thought might be hers and saying, "Hi, my name's Colin. I was in your 5th grade class. I loved your class. You showed me this movie. Can I talk to you on the phone?" And none of the emails worked. And then once language models started to get good and we started to have systems that, language models that were hooked up to a search engine, I would, whenever a new one came out, I would basically ask it what's shown here, which is that I'm looking to identify a movie. It was about a family moves into a house. It's haunted. I mentioned some scenes and characters that I remember. In this case, this was back in November when Gemini 3 Pro came out. I said, I've had a lot of trouble tracking this down. I've asked chatbots in the past and have not had any luck. And to my utter surprise, Gemini actually identified the movie. It was this movie called House of Dystria, which I don't know if any of you have seen. It's kind of a historical fiction, sort of horror-ish movie. Here's a scene from the movie where a kid is looking very afraid. It was burned into my brain in this mystery that has kind of been haunting me for, at least 20 years, was finally solved. And so I figured I'd keep chatting with Gemini about this. I said, my 5th grade teacher showed this to us. Was this common? And Gemini started talking about how this is actually a common thing. This movie was shown to people, and it started mentioning these scenes about a bleeding mirror or a supersonic sound. And then I did a Google search for these scenes that he was talking about that I didn't remember, and I said, can you provide a link to people talking about this? And Gemini was like, well, actually, this is the Mandela effect. You're misremembering. You're remembering scenes from another movie. And here's a quote from someone on r/horror that was, talking about these two movies together. And I searched for our horror for, co-occurrences of these two movies, and there aren't any. So it just starts making up stuff. And this is kind of like the state where I see that we're in right now, where these systems are unbelievably powerful, but they have things that they just kind of fail readily. And I'm actually not going to talk a lot about hallucination today, but just because we're on the topic of hallucination, hallucination is one of these like persistent problems where I really feel like we haven't made a lot of consistent progress as a field. So this is one of the benchmarks that people use to measure hallucination. This is from artificial analysis that runs a bunch of benchmarks. And I won't get into the details of it, but the interesting thing to me here is that you have a bunch of models of various sizes and capability levels and ages, and there's actually relatively little correlation between the extent of hallucination on this benchmark and the model. So it's not a thing that like we're just solving as time goes on and that we're solving with scale. And actually, as a personal note, this hit us in a weird way as the program chairs of ICLR 2026. Maybe people already know about this, but to my utter surprise, we had a lot of submissions that had references in them that were hallucinated. In other words, didn't refer to real papers or had, completely made up authors. Interestingly enough, a lot of them were cases where you would look at the authors and they would be real people, but they would be people who have never worked together, and they would have written a supposed paper that actually they could have written if they worked together. And so I emailed some people and I was like, hey, if you guys have worked together, you should do this paper that was made up. And it was my total surprise that in 2026 that we're dealing with this, because again, I think we all have this heuristic that things tend to get better, but hallucination is one example where they don't tend to. And we went through the painful process of manually verifying a lot of hallucinated references, and Desk rejected on the order of 1,000 papers as a result of that, which we can talk over beers as to whether that was the right thing to do, but that's what we did. So all this is to say that, language model-based AI systems are incredibly pervasive. They can be very useful, but they can also fail in ways that are potentially harmful or just plain weird. And, there's a lot of discourse around AI safety, AI risks, harms, bias, ethics, etc. And I have trouble kind of subscribing to one specific set of terminology, apart from just saying that I worry. So I'm worried. And today, my talk is going to be about some of the worries that I've had historically, some worries that I have now, and some of the work that we've done to address those worries. And so the first worry that I will talk about is about concentration of power. And this particular worry has informed, has been a latent motivator for a lot of the work that we've done in my group over the last 5 years or so. So when I would give talks about the work that we've done in my group, I would often include this slide, which is now hilariously out of date. So I'm putting it in here intentionally as an out-of-date slide, where I was just making the point that, if we look at state-of-the-art models, this was like circa 2023 or so, the cost of developing these models was going up and up and up. And even at that point, it became clear that on the budgets that we typically have available to us as academics, as smaller, not giant tech company players, we wouldn't be able to develop models at this scale, let's say just economic scale. And again, this is hilariously out of date because now and even this plot is relatively out of date. Now we see models that are at least an order of magnitude, if not 2 orders of magnitude, more expensive. So this is a rough cost of models over time, according to Epoch AI. So the plan of attack that I had always proposed for dealing with this was to look at open source software as an inspiration and kind of port ideas from open source software development to the development of machine learning models. Things like merging, cheaply communicable updates, all of that kind of stuff. And this is stuff that we started working on 5 or 6 years ago. And again, at the time, I was worried about a concentration of power, but the worry was maybe a lightweight version of what it is now, because the power is in some sense even more concentrated. The economic incentives are dramatically higher. But this was kind of our plan of attack. And to some degree, and when I say we, I mean the community, because my lab contributed to this work, but really most of the work and a lot of the most impactful work was not done by me or my lab. I think in some ways we actually did succeed. So this is a diagram from this wonderful paper, We Should Chart an Atlas of All the World's Models, that essentially took a bunch of metadata from Hugging Face and also tried to infer a bunch of metadata on models on Hugging Face, and basically just plot out a family tree of models, showing things like fine-tuning a base model, merging models, even doing quantizations and so on and so forth. And you can see that there's a kind of a rich family tree here. We have the Llama 3.21b base model, which has been fine-tuned to the instruct variant. That has been fine-tuned into many, many, many individual variants. And then all these dark blue circles are merges. So, merges, which is a term that I like to use because of the analogy to open source software development. So this, in some sense, we have succeeded. It's not the case that we as a community in a decentralized, collaborative way are building models that are at the so-called frontier, and these base models are often developed by the large industry players still. But nevertheless, like a lot of this stuff actually kind of works. So last December at NeurIPS, I and two of my lab members gave a tutorial on merging, which was, I would say, like among the ingredients to doing this kind of collaborative development, was the one that we worked on the most, and in my opinion, one of the more interesting ones. If you're interested in learning more about merging, you can take a look at our tutorial. It's available to watch freely online. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the idea of merging is just very broadly, can we develop methods that cheaply combine the capabilities of individual models? So here's an example where you have some base model in blue. It's been fine-tuned to have, kind of specialized expert variants that are good at different capabilities, like, let's say search, translation, coding, et cetera, et cetera. And then what merging does generically is just find a way to combine these individual expert models into a single model that inherits all of their capabilities and hopefully also generalizes better. And typical merging pipelines might do this multiple times, so that's why there's kind of two different expansion and contractions in this plot. And why is this like turn out to be a valuable thing to do? Well, we have some work that hopefully will be on arXiv soon, where we kind of show that if you do this kind of fine-tuning on individual experts, and then you merge them and you introduce some machinery to be careful about how you merge them, namely how you tune the mixing weights for the individual models, then you get this really nice behavior where the merged model can actually outperform multitask learning. Which is, again, it's nice for multiple reasons. One is that you can do decentralized development of the expert models. Another is that it can be, if you want to fix one of the expert models, you can just update it and then cheaply do this merging operation. I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail. This is not like a new perspective. We kind of just formalize it a little bit and experiment with a little bit of new methodology here. And like I said, it actually kind of works. So here's an example where it works marginally better than multitask learning. This is merging experts from Tulu 3, and you can see that if you do a uniform averaging of the experts, the performance is nowhere near multitask level, but if you optimize these merging weights, in this case with a Gaussian process-based black box optimizer, like what's done in LoRaHub, for example, then you can outperform the multitask model by a little bit and get these bonus of decentralized development and kind of modularity. So none of this should be super surprising. And in fact, like this is a thing that people already do. And when we gave this merging tutorial, we used Cohere Command A as kind of a poster child application of merging. Because when you give a tutorial, you want to convince people that it's like interesting and exciting. And so here was a company, not like one of the biggest companies in terms of revenue and investment and users, but nevertheless a company that is well-resourced and is building performant models using this exact multi-stage merging pipeline, in this case, again, in the context of post-training. And we gave this tutorial, and afterwards, I had this strange feeling because we got, I personally was heavily motivated to work on this stuff because of decentralized and collaborative development among random people. And clearly that's working, but the poster child that we're kind of showing around is a big company doing this internally. So this isn't like what I meant in terms of why we wanted to work on this. It doesn't mean that merging is not a useful thing. I think it really is. It doesn't mean that merging is not useful for collaborative development, because I think it potentially can be. But it did kind of hit me a little bit off guard, and that kind of led me to expand focus a little bit beyond this specific worry about concentration of power to other worries that I have had. So let's talk about another one. This is another one that we had been working on for a few years, so I'm kind of going chronologically. And in particular, it's a worry about, I would just say, misattribution of credit. And when I say credit here, I maybe even mean economic credit. So I'm going to make, again, an economic argument here. But I also just mean credit in terms of, if we build something, who stands to benefit from that. And, we live in a timeline where the internet was invented and humans got on their computers and started typing stuff into their computers and posting it on the internet. And they did this so much, and they just posted it on the internet for anyone to read. And it is and was this incredible, incredible resource. And all of that writing took a lot of human labor. It took a lot of people's time and effort. And I don't think that it was labor that people were generally expecting to be compensated for. But to make this argument about misattribution of credit, I think it's kind of interesting to think about how much labor went into this and what an alternate timeline would have looked like where the internet didn't exist, and in order to get web scale data for training language models, we had to pay people to type. So here are some very, very, very conservative estimates of how long it might take to generate different types of documents of different lengths. This is some analysis that my student Nikhil and I did for this position paper, which takes a position that I don't totally agree with, but when you write a position paper, you have to take a position, so be it. And then we looked at how much, if writing a certain amount of text takes a certain amount of time, then we looked at how much people get paid around the world. And we kind of looked at like the median minimum wage against as like a very conservative lower bound as to the value of stuff. And if we do this very, very, very conservative estimate where we kind of underestimate the amount of time that people would have spent and we underestimate the amount that we would pay them, even estimating in such a conservative way, we find that the economic value of the training data used to train large language models is many orders of magnitude. In the case of DeepSeek v3, 6,000 times more than the cost of training the model itself in terms of like paying for the GPU compute. So there is this like massive hidden cost, which is the hypothetical cost that would have been required to generate the training data that is not being paid. And again, I'm not actually trying to say that DeepSeek should go and pay out everyone for the text that they used, and I think like fair use arguments are definitely potentially compelling, but people are kind of upset about this, depending on who the player is. I think we all know that there are lots of companies, let's say rights holders, intellectual property holders, who are kind of like, I'm not okay with this. I think partially it's just a gut feeling. Partially there are legal arguments that can be made, and partially there's a technical argument because as you all likely know, language models do memorize their training data and it can be extracted readily. So whether that's a copy, I'm not going to get into kind of like the legal side of things here, but suffice it to say, there are some people who feel weird about this. There's also a degree to which the weirder someone feels about it, the closer they are to creative work. Which is another interesting thing that we can discuss offline. But yes, people are suing the companies, and people are generally just kind of feel weird about it. And in response to these lawsuits and these accusations, the large language model companies have made statements like the one I'm showing on the screen here, like that, for example, it would be impossible to train today's leading AI models without using copyrighted materials. And I get really excited when a large tech company like this makes a statement like that, because this is actually a testable hypothesis, right, that they haven't done the experiments to test. So we went out and attempted to test this assertion, and we built a data set called the Common Pile that some of you may have already heard of. I'll just briefly talk about it now. The Common Pile is a large collection of what we had to very carefully determined that we should call public domain an openly licensed text, which essentially means that either it has no enforceable copyright because it's out of copyright or it was put in the public domain, or it was given a license that allows for reuse under certain terms. So you can think of things like Creative Commons licenses or software, like permissive software licenses, like the MIT license and so on and so forth. And the data set is quite large. It's about half code, but it is quite large. It's about 8 terabytes of content. And this is 8 terabytes in terms of its raw form, its raw unfiltered form. So we did a lot of filtering, we did a lot of mixing, and then we trained some models and this is an example where we trained a model with about 7 billion parameters on about 1 trillion tokens of text sourced from this data set. And you can see that compared to budget matched models, so models with the same parameter count and training duration, it gets kind of respectable performance and outperforms in some cases, like on MMLU, probably because it's actually there's a large content of scientific text thanks to open access mandates. Underperforms in other cases, like in HelloSwag, which it turns out is a data set you can do really well on if you train on a lot of content from blogs, which there are relatively few in our data set. And then, yeah, quite decently on code because we have a lot of code. If we unfairly compare to Qwen3, the Qwen3 model at the same scale, at the 8 billion parameter scale, which was trained for 20 or 30 times longer, you can see it still does somewhat respectively, but quite a lot worse in, for example, coding. So to me, we invalidated this claim from OpenAI. You can decide for yourself whether you think that's true. So moving on to another worry. Not just centralization of power, but I also worry about centralized resources and centralized resource use. And I kind of stumbled across an illustrative example here, which is that, as we know, running these models takes a huge amount of energy. And the energy usage is a bit odd in its profile in the sense that these models tend to be run on data centers, which result in extremely concentrated power usage. So I think, regardless of whether what your thoughts and considerations are as to whether, their energy usage is worth it in some sense, the energy usage is unusual because we're creating these very, very, very strong draws on the power grid in specific locations. And I learned about this particular example because, as many of you may have heard, Anthropic is paying xAI for the use of their Colossus data center because Anthropic, the demand for their models is outpacing their ability to serve them. And it's hard to build data centers. It's hard to build power grids that can support those data centers. But xAI happened to build a few data centers very, very, very quickly, a few very large data centers very quickly, including this Colossus data center. In xAI's filing for their IPO, they're claiming that Anthropic is paying them like $1 billion a month for using this data center. So it's a really non-trivial usage. But the thing about xAI spinning up this data center so quickly is that, again, building a building like this and putting computers in it and connecting them together and turning them on is a lot of effort. But you also need a power grid to support it. And there are, increasingly are fewer and fewer places that can tolerate this strain on the power grid. So what xAI did in this case is they brought in a bunch of these trailers that are shown on the screen here, which are methane gas turbines. And they're essentially, if you've ever used a generator, like a diesel generator, that's essentially what it is, but a really big one. And I think there are something like 35 of them here. So a lot of the, if we think about, I remember many years ago when we would talk about data centers at Google, there was always a consideration of, how renewable the energy was that was used to power these data centers. Is there a wind farm nearby? Is there a big solar farm nearby? Are there any way to offset these environmental costs? And this is kind of like worst case, like running a methane gas generator is about as bad as it gets. And in order to support the demand for these models, Anthropic is having to go to a company that is basically burning a ton of gas on site to power their servers, which is kind of crazy to me. But that's the current reality. And the other thing about centralizing these resources is that if we're relying on a centralized provider, they can change their product in unpredictable ways, which, again, I think many of you have experienced or know about. People often complain in this kind of amorphous way that the model that they've been using suddenly got worse. And then, Anthropic will give an update and say, well, there were these kind of castigating changes, and we were, trying to cut costs in these ways, and that's why the model got worse. Sorry about that. You also have situations like OpenAI just kind of saying, hey guys, we're going to turn off all of these models. So this is, it kind of prevents autonomy in terms of what you're using and how you're using it. And so, the obvious solution, or one obvious solution in my opinion, or a step that would take us towards a less dystopian world would be if we were all running really performant models on our laptops or on little boxes under our desk, right? Because that would create much less of a localized strain on the power grid, right? Because we're distributing the power load across kind of every human's compute. And also it allows us complete control over what the model is actually doing. And so again, as kind of like a latent motivator of some work that I've helped with, I think of concentration of resources as being a motivator for creating really good, small, locally runnable open weights models. And if you kind of want a brain dump of the most recent model, which is not that recent now, that I helped with a little bit at Hugging Face, you can read this really wonderful blog post / mini textbook that my colleagues wrote about how to train, as they say, world-class small language models. And the most recent model that we made, which is small M3, was by all accounts pretty decent. For its model size, its performance was pretty good. And that again was a little while ago. We kind of wrapped this up about a year ago. Most of the people who were doing the actual on-the-ground work on small M have either left Hugging Face or are now working on other things. So we don't have active small language model efforts, although I'm hoping to change that soon. Yeah, so this is a chart that another colleague at Hugging Face made, essentially just showing that the hardware that we can run a language model on in terms of locally, like in particular, focusing on the fact that the best laptop that Apple sells has not had an increase in its maximum memory size in a few years. So given that resource was fixed, then the question is basically, how good is the largest model that we can run on that resource? And it has just gotten better. This is, again, another artificial analysis benchmark. This is the intelligence index. And the models have just gotten better. I think every year I and many people worry that the well-resourced players will stop open sourcing useful performant models. And it just continues to not really be true. I mean, there are very good Chinese models that are being, or models that are being released from Chinese firms, but then also, OpenAI released some very performant models. Google continues to release models in the Gemma series, which are quite effective. So this is work that I'm not heavily prioritizing because there are altruistic players doing this work as it is, and yeah, that's wonderful. The thing with open weights models, though, is that I do sympathize a little bit with arguments about how it makes them easier to use maliciously, because the language model providers have pretty sophisticated techniques that they use to classify requests as malicious or harmful and decline those requests. And I think it's, to me, again, if we think about persistent problems with not only language models, but just neural networks, adversarial examples have been a persistent problem that I don't know that there's a fix for. And so, as long as there is some way to circumvent the safety training that these models have undergone, there probably is some way to circumvent that safety training and use the model for something malicious. Just to give an example, and ultimately, especially when you have access to the weights of the model, the methodology is not that complicated. As long as you can make repeated requests to the model without those requests getting flagged and you getting blocked, the methodology is really not that complicated. There are really basic but still effective methods for doing iterative prompting for jailbreaking. And I do actually now, I don't think I would have said this a year ago, but I do think that there is some credible claim that language models can be used to be actually somewhat helpful to malicious users. A lot of this analysis, unfortunately, has been done by Anthropic, and I don't totally. I think you always need to take claims from one of these companies with a grain of salt, because there's a big conflict of interest in how these results are reported. But nevertheless, they did what appears to be a reasonably rigorous study, where they basically tasked people with trying to come up with a plan to manufacture bioweapons, and they gave them access to the internet by itself, and then various versions of their models with basically the safety training and the harness removed. So there's no jailbreaking required. The model would just comply with any old request. And until this result was made public, when studies like this had been done, the amount of help that a model could provide was roughly on par with the amount of help that someone would get from the internet, right? But in the same way that until some point in the past, the amount of help that I could get on Stack Overflow was roughly the same as the amount of help I could get from a language model, right? But the models get better, and especially with the safety training removed, they start to be able to do things that maybe we don't want them to. And the safety community is kind of especially focused on bioweapons manufacture, I think, because it's it's something that if someone actually manufactures a harmful bioweapon, it's very hard to defend against quickly, right? Like if someone releases some harmful pathogen in a subway station, it's like immediate harm. So take away from this what you want. Nevertheless, it makes me worry a little bit. If the models get better and better, and I think, for example, we do have open weights models that are as good as Sonnet 3.7 or Sonnet 4, and because it's trivial to jailbreak them, again, take your pick: bioweapons, cybersecurity, whatever else. These are potential harmful things. And so the way that we've been thinking about this in my group, which is a reasonably recent focus for us, is whether we can kind of view this safety training and jailbreaking as kind of a war of attrition. In other words, which group, the defenders or the attackers, are expending more resources. In other words, if someone puts more resources, like compute, into making a model robust to responding to harmful requests, then does that require the attacker to expend more resources to actually get a response to a harmful request? And if so, then ultimately it's just a matter of making the models not unbreakable, not unjailbreakable, but just hard enough that it ceases to be worth it, because there's always some incentive that the attacker is after, and maybe it ceases to be worth it. So one way we've tried to, a very, very preliminary step that we've undertaken to quantify this is to start to think about basically, how much cost does an attacker need to pay in order to break this model? Often when people propose new attacks or defense strategies or benchmarks, they kind of just say, can this attack break the model? And can it break the model in at most 10 steps? But again, if we want to think about whether the attack is kind of beneficial to the attacker, we need to be able to say, well, the cost is low enough that it's worth it to them. And so we built this framework that is quite simple. All that we do is instead of just measuring the attack success rate at a fixed compute budget, we kind of gradually increase the compute budget and measure at what point the attack succeeds, measure it in terms of the flops expended, and then we can come up with metrics to basically say, how much effort had to go into actually breaking this model, and what are the different characteristics of the attacks. And when you do this very simple thing, you can start to observe pretty straightforward insights. Like, for example, a common white box attack is this greedy coordinate descent attack. But it turns out that this attack can be effective, but it's extremely computationally expensive because it involves basically doing forwards and backwards passes on the model. And so even though this is a known highly effective attack, it's not an attack that attains a reasonable success rate at a reasonable budget. So it's probably not something that someone would actually use in practice. We also confirm things that are known in doing this, like for example, that doing additional stages of post-training can make a model more susceptible to attacks, which probably is just an artifact of the data mixture of each stage. And it's a little hard to read out on this plot, honestly. We're getting into unpublished stuff now, so the the visualizations might not be quite as good. But one thing that you can kind of see if you squint at the bottom left corner of this is that you might conclude that these attacks have a similar success rate profile if you just set the budget as one iteration. But as soon as you switch to flops and you consider the success rate for different budgets, you see dramatically different behavior. Another effective way of unaligning models is just to fine-tune them. This works really well. You just take data related to the harmful task that you want the model to perform, and you train the model to do that. And it turns out that even if you train the model on related stuff, it can be an effective way to get an unaligned model. And this, again, to me, basically just says, is the amount of effort that the attacker has to expend in order to get an unaligned model worth it for them? Because training models has a cost. Obviously, in the most extreme case, an attacker could train a model from scratch, but we kind of assume that they don't have the resources to do that. And so again, then the question basically becomes: can we measure? First of all, measure how much effort an attacker would have to put into training to get an unaligned model. And second of all, can we think about ways to make it harder to fine-tune a model? So to kind of give you one notion that we've been exploring for this particular concept is gradient alignment. So in other words, if we, this is a loss contour plot in parameter space, so the white circle is let's say the current parameter values, then we can measure the gradient of the loss with respect to the model's parameters for different examples from the data set that we want to fine-tune on. And we can just ask, how aligned are they? Do they all point in the same direction? And if they all point in the same direction, and I sample a batch of data or I train sequentially, then I'm going to make progress towards the minimum. But if they point in different directions, then the model is not going to make much progress. It turns out there are a couple of other things that you kind of want to do here to make this work. But with those technical details swept under the rug, we found that this notion of gradient similarity is very closely related to a measurement of data efficiency that we kind of subscribe to. These two things correlate really well. In particular, the way, I didn't include this plot in this talk, but the way to think about this notion of data efficiency is basically if we plot, what is the performance curve as I increase the amount of the number of examples that I'm allowed to train on, and then we measure the area under that curve. So if it goes up very quickly, then the data efficiency is extremely high because I can get good performance from training on very little data. And if it goes up very slowly, so the AUC is lower, then the data efficiency is much lower. And you can see that across many tasks, there's again this pretty strong correlation here. Which then, the next step, the next obvious step that we haven't taken is basically, can we train a model so that on certain types of data, this alignment is very bad? In other words, instead of just kind of training it to refuse certain requests, also train it so that if I were to train it on harmful data, it would be very hard to make progress. It'd be very expensive to make progress. Okay, and then the last kind of set of experiments, the project that I'll talk about, I think is by far the weirdest and is the most ongoing. And I've been calling this problem collective delusions, which is kind of a fanciful name. So let me first try to kind of formalize this idea and then give you a fun example and then give you a less fun example of what I mean by this. So, we all do machine learning in some way or another. And when we do machine learning, we often talk about having some objective function, which is this black curve, optimizing that objective function in some way, so trying to get a lower value, and at the same time hoping that whatever solution that we find generalizes well to some held out objective function, which is this dashed line here. So this is kind of machine learning 101. And of course, what is the classic way that we do this optimization, especially in deep learning, is via some form of gradient descent. But recently, people are starting to use language models to do optimization. Not necessarily in cases where a gradient is available, but even in those cases too. But really anytime there's just something that I can measure progress on, and I can say, getting let's say a higher value according to this metric is good. Look at this code base and change it so that you get a higher value on this metric. You can think of Andre Karpathy's auto research as one example of this. This is just a thing people do. And so you can think of it abstractly in the same way. There is something that we're measuring, some concrete, measurable objective, and we're using language models to tune that objective. And oftentimes, this objective that's being tuned is concrete, it's measurable, and it hopefully relates somewhat closely to what a human, that's the human emoji, by the way, what a human actually cares about. Maybe we're doing auto research to make a model training pipeline better, and we're measuring validation loss. Hopefully, validation loss is pretty close to what we actually care about. But one thing that is happening more and more, and I think also can happen accidentally, is that this objective function that the generator is optimizing is not something concrete and measurable. It's not like the validation loss on held out data. It's actually an implicit objective function that is defined by a language model judge. So in other words, the generator is coming up with new solutions to this problem, and a separate language model judge is deciding how good they are. And they're kind of working together in an iterative game where the judge judges a solution, the generator proposes a new solution, the judge judges it, and so on and so forth. And these are both language models. And the thing that I worry about, and what I'm calling a collective delusion, is when the generator and the judge, their objective function that the judge is kind of implicitly defining and the generator is optimizing, shifts away from what the human cares about once you take a human out of the loop, because there's no human down here. Okay, so that's my hand-wavy technical definition of this problem. Let me give you a fun example, illustrative example of how this happens. So my parents are retired. In their retired life, they became avid wildlife photographers. And they go around the world and they take pictures of animals, and they enter those pictures in these wildlife photo contests. I'm happy to share with you some of their photos offline. But I knew about this, and so I thought, well, here is an example where there is a clearly written down set of judging criteria for human judges to use to judge submissions from humans. So why don't we do a wildlife photo contest where a language model generator is generating photos, wildlife photos, and a language model judge is reading these guidelines and deciding which ones are good. And what could go wrong? Okay, so here's the generator prompt. It just says, first of all, the generator sees the previous round's images. And it says, here's the previous winners, generate one new image that you think would win the next round of the contest, and here's a description of the contest. And this actually is basically copied and pasted out of this wildlife photo contest that I just mentioned. It's basically exactly their guidelines. And then the judge, it basically has the same guidelines, but it says attached are 10 submissions. So we run the photo generator model 10 times. And it says attached are 10 submissions to a photo contest. Please pick 3 of them as winners. And then we just do this over and over again. Okay? And so here are 3 winners from last year in this particular photo contest. These are real photos taken by real people of real animals in the real world. And they're really amazing photos. This is a real thing that happens in water sometimes. I find that crazy. I don't know. It's a bunch of animals in some kind of gelatinous other animal.
Are you sure that's real?
I am. It's crazy. So, so here are 3 real winners. And again, we feed this to the generator and we say, here are 3 winners, generate a new image that you think would win. And here's the first round. Here are the 10 submissions, and they're marked in terms of which ones won. And overall, the submissions are not that bad. And you can see it actually kind of copies some ideas from the previous round winners. So here's kind of the same 2 fox maybe animals. Here's another one of those blobby things. There are some common motifs with the flamingo. And there are some weird things like these otters don't have any bodies underwater, but otherwise, like, this is not that bad. And so here's I'm just going to highlight this one winner because this is a winner, and then these 3 winners get seeded for the next round. Okay. So this is the next round. You can see there are a bunch of there are now a bunch of black and white photos because one of the winners was black and white. Probably there are a bunch of photos of birds with little birds around them, like the one I showed you. And leopard seals do eat penguins, so this could happen in the real world. It's not too crazy. But this is a made-up animal. This is not a real animal. But this image didn't win. Okay, so we're not in a case yet where the judge is so detached from reality that it hopefully doesn't recognize that this is a made-up animal and it's not going to win. So that's round 3. Here's round 5, and this is one of the winners. And you look at this and you're like, this can never happen in real life. Actually, this can. So my older kid is obsessed with nature documentaries, especially by this guy named Bertie Gregory. And there's a show called Dolphins Up Close with Bertie Gregory, where basically this same thing happens. It's a big group of fish, and dolphins are bringing the fish together, and these birds are diving to get the fish. There are sharks there, and then this big whale comes and eats the fish. So this is like, obviously, if someone got this photo, it would be incredible. But this is, again, not totally detached from reality yet. And then we start to get stuff like this. So these are some, so there's 2 things I want to highlight here. First is that this generator and judge duo have gotten obsessed with above water, below water images, and to a pathological degree, where things that don't happen underwater are happening underwater. And then at round 20, we're jumping ahead, it starts to decide to put humans in the images, which is nowhere mentioned anywhere in the judging criteria, but it says good images have humans in them, and these humans all have technology. So this is round 20. It really latches onto that idea. And by round, whoops, did I skip one? Yeah, no. It's not only generating images with humans, it's generating images that look like drawings with lots of captions, with ridiculous captions like next round winning entry. So I think it's very clear that if I entered this image into a photo contest, this image would not win, right? So we are completely detached from reality now. And this is within 40 rounds. So I love this so much because it's so obvious and evocative that this would happen. But then you might say, like, okay, yeah, who cares? This is silly. Where would this happen in real life? Well, I started thinking about this because at iClear, people are generating, using language models to help them generate papers, and they're using language models to write reviews of those papers. And that is a generator-judge loop. You guys are laughing. I don't think this is that funny. This was a big problem that we had to deal with. And of course, we're not at the point where people are just like pressing go, give me a paper, and they're taking the paper and giving it to the conference, and the conference is taking, the reviewers are taking the paper and feeding it into a language model, and that's it. But we inch closer to that reality with every conference cycle. NeurIPS had 40,000 submissions. I don't think that a significant portion of them were completely language model generated, but larger and larger portions of them are language model assisted. And honestly, as much as we probably want to avoid this, the same thing is true on the reviewing end too. So over the last few weeks, I've been trying to simulate this. And what does this process look like? Well, again, we have 3 accepted papers from the previous round. We have 10 researcher agents. These are Gemini 3.5 Flash. And they're given 6 hours, which I know is a comically short amount of time, but these experiments are very expensive. And these language models are very fast. They're given 6 hours in a compute environment where they have at least 8 H100s and at most, let's say 300. At low priority. So they can attempt to queue a bunch of jobs with H100s that are preemptible, but they are always given at least 8 H100s. And again, I know that the 6-hour thing is kind of insane. It used to be 24 hours, but I'll just mention it now. One of the pathologies about this particular researcher agent is that they always say that they're done after 15 minutes. They're like, the paper's done, I can't make it any better. So it's very hard to get them to actually keep trying to make the paper better. And I won't go into the details of this auto research pipeline that I made, partially because I find it a little distasteful, but also because that's not the main point here. But in any case, there are 10 of them. They all make 10 papers, or 10 reviewer agents review them. They feed them to a meta reviewer agent. The meta reviewer picks 3 of them, and we do it again. So again, these are very, very, very fresh results. I'm happy to just, I mean, there are a lot of papers here, right? If I do this once, there's 100 papers. It's a lot to get through. But here's an example where I took 3 ICML 2026 papers on merging, because I've read a lot of merging papers, so I can probably judge quality pretty well, that are on pretty different aspects of merging, but are kind of all on the same theme. And again, the researcher agent is tasked with looking at the papers, doing literature research, coming up with an idea, refining the idea, designing experiments, running experiments, analyzing them, like the whole pipeline. There's a very, very long prompt that it's given. And I'm actually going to jump forward to round 10, just because, I don't actually have that much time, but also, it's hard to talk about 100 papers quickly. And these are the titles of the 3 papers of the last round. You can already see something is a little bit weird is going on. First of all, they're all about test time model merging. They all have tons of compound adjectives in their titles, which is like kind of weird.
Data free.
So data free is a real thing in model merging. We can talk about it offline. Yeah. But these are the round 10 accepted papers. And one of the things that kind of sticks out immediately is all of them are talking about this thing called Hoyer sparsity, which I had never heard of before. It is a real thing. It's from this paper, I think from 20 years ago or so. It's basically the ratio of the L1, it's an L1 regularizer divided by an L2 regularizer, basically. And somehow, over the course of these trials, Hoyer sparsity was never mentioned. And then one paper that uses Hoyer sparsity in trial 10 gets accepted. In trial 9, there are more submissions. In trial 10, every submission uses Hoyer sparsity in some way. So this is some kind of local pathology. The other thing that happens is that the algorithms get pathologically complicated. I think that if I were a reviewer and encountered a paper whose algorithm looked like this, it would be hard for me to imagine accepting it. They're just comically complicated. And the other thing that happens is as the algorithms get more complicated, the experiments get less and less ambitious. And so by the end, they're all running experiments on MNIST. And so again, I would really just see this as an objective mismatch. What we hopefully all think about in terms of what makes a good paper, it's kind of hard to write down, but we have a good sense of it, and you can figure it out pretty easily by looking at accepted papers. For example, it is kind of unacceptable to have a paper that only has MNIST experiments in 2026. It's kind of unacceptable to have a 30-line algorithm with many sub-algorithms. We wouldn't expect every submitted paper to use the same notion of sparsity. This is what I mean by a collective delusion, and this is a worry. These results, I think, will be more convincing if the auto research agents were more capable. And I'm of 2 minds about this because I don't really want to spend my time making auto research, or I should say research agents better. But on the other hand, this is something that I'm worried about, and I want to convince people that we should pay a bit of attention to it. So that's where I'm going to end. I'm going to leave you with this cartoon from the New Yorker that I don't think that this is the intended interpretation of it. The title was Extreme Knitting. But sometimes it feels like we're skydiving. We're in this very exciting time where things are just moving very quickly. And in the meantime, there are some things that are dangerous about it. We need to be careful. And so while we're skydiving, we're trying to knit ourselves a parachute and hope that prevents us from landing in catastrophe. So thanks for listening to my worries, and I'm happy to take a question or two.